Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Harfield, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Blackboard Analytics. This is our final Q&A in our series of interviews live from the IBM booth at EDUCAUSE this year. And I'm joined here with Rachel Scherer, the Senior Product Manager for Blackboard Analytics. Since joining Blackboard less than a year ago, your passion for learning analytics is apparent in rapid evolution of Analytics for Learn, Blackboard's Learning Analytics Workbench. Last week, Blackboard announced support for Rubric reporting and granular tool detail. What is it that drives your interest in building learning analytics tools?
I think what really drives my interest in building learning analytics tools is actually the real human interaction that they can facilitate, right? I was a client of Blackboard at one point in time. I've worked in various roles in education, in K-12, in higher ed, and pro ed at various points.
And you have training in psychology as well.
I have training in psychology and in decision science and that sort of thing, right? And throughout, one of the things that has most frustrated me about learning tools broadly and learning analytics tools kind of wrapped into that is that when executed in the way that they have often been executed, they can actually end up being a barrier to a real conversation.
Oh, interesting.
Right. So what's interesting to me is thinking about the information that we're providing in the context of the conversation that people can have about that information and in the context of the decisions that they can make as a result of receiving that information.
No, and that's really quite evident when you talk about the Rubric detail report,
right.
One of many that we released last week. The fact that it's especially designed to provide high quality information while at the same time functioning as an artifact for conversation.
Yeah, and so the Rubric detail report, that was kind of a fun project for us because so as you know, like one of the pieces that came out of that was that we've actually started to represent that same rubric in the way that people are used to seeing it. So it does serve as a focal point for the conversation about the rubric that people kind of know and love, that people crafted together, and then using that focal point as a way to talk about how the rubric was interacted with.
So you mentioned that you were a customer prior to joining Blackboard. This is actually a fairly common trait among Blackboarders. How has your experience in higher education informed your work as a partner now in support of the very kinds of institution that you used to be a part of yourself?
It was an interesting shift, and actually this has also felt like a really common experience for a lot of folks that I work with here at Blackboard now. It was a very interesting shift coming into this side of the world, not because you end up shifting the fundamental focus. I feel like what I've been able to do is really continue to keep thinking about the things that used to frustrate me, use that as a way to fuel the types of things that we can do going forward, but also to think again about that concept of the people and the things that they need in order to achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve, right? Kind of broadly in the learning analytics space. So I think I don't know. Generally, big takeaways were thinking about the conversations that were not being facilitated by the information that I had access to, and thinking about how I could better get there.
So you're in an incredible position to function really as a strong advocate on behalf of customers, and it's that customer-focused sensibility that's obvious in what you bring to decisions about product roadmap and design,
yep,
and all those things that make the product what it is today, which is incredibly strong. So when I think about academic technologies, I think about the fact that they're not neutral, right? They're designed to have an impact on human behavior. That is their design. And to that extent, the design of products is inextricable from questions about ethics and questions about values, and it would be, I think, inaccurate to say that values did not play an important part in those design decisions. So the question that I have for you is, what values, from your perspective, inform product management decisions in analytics, and how would you like to see those values more broadly reflected in higher education technologies more generally?
Wonderful. Yep. When I think about values, when I think about values in education technology, when I think about values in analytics, right? Of course, you've got sort of some of those core types of concepts, right? Being conscientious about who you're exposing data to, being conscientious about why you're exposing data, right? When you're dealing in data, you end up having a lot of power, and you end up empowering a lot of people potentially with that type of information. I think personally, beyond a lot of those types of topics, what drives me is this realization that education, teaching, learning is not a top-down type of function, right? And broadly, when you're dealing in data, even outside of the education industry, you tend to start to think more quantitatively. You tend to start to think that if I can measure it, so I can begin to describe it, so I can begin to prescribe it, and then you start, in some cases, going down this rabbit hole where you can be in a position to feel like you know what is best for people, and you know what the best behaviors are, and you know how best to measure them, and that sort of thing. I think that the value that I've most tried to pervade my thinking here is keeping the student, keeping the faculty member, keeping the administrator, the advisor most close at heart and most close in mind as we think about the way that we're presenting information to them, and as we think about why we're presenting information to them, such that we're not running the risk of becoming this sort of top-down prescriptive tool set, right? One of the things that I'd really like to see us thinking about is that we take a complementary role in any of the thinking that any of the consumers of the information that we produce ultimately put forth, right? We can provide information, we can empower, we can nudge, we can do all of these types of things, but ultimately we are a partner in that you end up having to take that information and deciding what to do with it and deciding to take action.
So a lot of people end up quoting Peter Drucker. It's uncertain who actually came up with this phrase, but what gets measured gets managed.
Yep.
And it's unfortunate because it speaks to a history of analytics that is really closely tied with this desire to give a large amount of data to a small number of people so that they can make decisions that have a large impact, right?
Right.
And what I'm hearing you say is that there's a move to use data in such a way as to create high-quality conversations, and that break down silos, to coin a phrase, right? Sure. And that bring campuses, various stakeholders together on campus to really make differences that are going to better serve all of those people, right? Faculty, students, instructional designers, administrators alike. Right.
And I mean, thinking about that concept of measurement, right, and kind of changing the application, right, away from measurement to management, and more toward measurement to understanding and empathy, and as a facilitator of those conversations, right, as a thread in that conversation, peer-to-peer on campus.
To a more lofty question, I want you to start predicting the future here, right? The very long, short, distant future. Looking at the next 20 years in higher education, what do you see the biggest challenges, and how can technology work to solve those?
Interestingly, right, of course, like we're seeing the beginnings of 20 years from now, and I think that the trend that we're starting to see is this move away from the LMS as being a sufficient grounding point for online education and for student and faculty interaction, and for kind of shoehorning in these other types of interactions that are important, which we used to do in the past. And I think what we're finding is that the LMS is not obviously the only or the most holistic place that you're seeing very important interactions and conversations beginning to occur, right? What that means for education technology is that we're starting to see people moving toward a much more diverse learning environment for their institution, a much more personalized learning environment for their institution, a learning environment that they are able to curate themselves, right? There's a lot more choice out there in terms of, whether it's vendors or partners or other institutions that you can be trading content with. I mean, there's just an incredible amount of choice that is out there. And what that means for us in step with education technology is that we need to be prepared to meet that diversity in a way that is comprehensive, clean, and provides a good user experience in answering those questions, facilitating those conversations across domain areas, across problems, across time. So where I see learning analytics shifting and adding value as this environment continues to change is in thinking more strongly in terms of standards, thinking more strongly in terms of openness, matching those two values with strong commitments to things like privacy, and most importantly, spending time because schools are now better empowered to craft the experience that they're presenting to their students and to the other people who interact in that environment. Spending a lot more time with schools to understand how they are evolving in their thinking about how they use this space.
I remember working in analytics 5 years ago, right? In order to get high quality data required essentially hobbling faculty and others, limiting the educational technologies that they use, because we need the data, and forcing educators to use those technologies in very standard ways. Because as we look forward to the future, and we're seeing this now, what I'm hearing you say is that we're able to leverage open standards so that we can encourage faculty and institutions to use technologies in the way that makes the most sense, while at the same time garnering that data and being able to expose it in a way that is able to facilitate those high-impact practices without constraint.
Right, absolutely right. So we're moving from a sort of, as you said, constrained, modularized way of thinking about the tools that we can offer and then measure well and that sort of thing. And we're flipping it on its head, right? We're thinking about how we can leverage the technologies of today to actually meet institutions, meet students, meet faculty where they want to be, and without creating a barrier for them to get there.